Welcome to CPU Cooling Part 1. I'm going to split this into two pieces because I've got a lot to cover here. I want to make sure I can take my time and get it to you in a way that you can understand it quite easily. CPUs are great, right? They're the brains of our computers, and they continue to get faster and faster and faster, and we like that. However, the faster these CPUs get, the hotter they run. The harder they work, the hotter they get, just like we do. So CPUs are little heaters, if you will. They're sitting on that motherboard. They're not in a good place to be creating heat for us. And so we're going to have to make sure that we keep the CPU cool, that we get that heat away from the other motherboard components, because they'll overheat. We'll start to lose functionalities. We'll start to get intermittent surfaces. The computer will go down. So we're going to have to deal with heat. Now there are 4 types of CPU, central processing unit, cooling that you need to be aware of for the exam. Okay, those 4 types are heat sinks, fans, thermal paste, and liquid based cooling. Now keep in mind, these aren't mutually exclusive. Quite often, and I'll show you a photograph in just a moment, where if I'm using a heat sink, I'm also using a fan. I may even be using some thermal paste as well. And so you'll kind of mix and match these. Different people go about them different ways. But let's start with the heat sink. Now, notice that in the photograph here, we're going to use a heat sink. And what it does is it simply sits right on top of the CPU, and it dissipates heat into the surrounding air. It basically absorbs heat from the CPU and then separates it into the air. If you've ever sat with your laptop actually on your lap with nothing between the laptop and you notice that after about 30-45 minutes, the bottom of that laptop's getting really warm to the point that you can't stand to keep it on your lap anymore. That's your friendly CPU at work creating heat. All right. Now laptops and a lot of devices are built so that the bottom of the machine gets warm, so that different aspects of the machine get warm, and it's actually doing its job. It's dissipating that heat. And while you've got that laptop sitting on your lap, guess what? You're the heat sink, okay? The heat's being absorbed into you and away from that CPU. So notice this is a picture. This is a heat sink, the silver aluminum looking thing right here. It is aluminum. And it is sitting just right down on top of the CPU. And as the CPU gets hot, heat transfers into the heat sink. And you can't tell it here, but here's another heat sink back here without a fan on it, on another piece of functionality on the motherboard. But notice the heat goes up into this thing, and these are elongated. They're fins. There's space between them. Air moves between them. So the heat gets soaked or carried up into this, and then the air moving around these fins dissipates the heat and takes it off, takes it away from the particular unit that we're trying to protect. Now, in this instance, they're using a fan, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. Now, what's the disadvantage of using a heat sink? Well, dust. If we don't keep the inside of our computer clean, dust will collect in there, and as dust collects on these heat sinks, they get less and less efficient at dissipating that heat out into the air around them, and so our CPU gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then it'll start to have problems. Also, airflow blockages. You see this a lot, especially in corporate environments where people will inadvertently with their feet push their desktop computer. It's under the desk. They'll push it back against the wall. They'll stack papers and stuff around it. Air can't get in. So keep in mind, as this heat gets dissipated off the top and sides of this heat sink, it needs to do something to get out of that case. Okay, so if we block the vents, then we're dissipating that heat out into the air, and now we're just kind of spreading it all over the motherboard, and that creates issues. So big disadvantages for the heat sink are dust and airflow. Now, fans. You'll see fans all over the place in a PC, and you'll even notice I'm using the same photograph here. The fan simply forces heat away from the CPU. So this fan's going to turn and pull the heat up off the CPU. So we've got the double whammy going here. That's a Southern technical term for 2 different functionalities at the same time. Notice this heat sink is absorbing heat, moving it away from the CPU, and then this fan is either blowing or pulling, and pulling that heat away from that heat sink even faster. And so that's the idea. Notice right here, this one does not have a fan. We're just letting the heat kind of ooze up here and move out into the atmosphere, this fan is forcing it. Okay, and often you see fans used along with heat sinks. Now, what's the big disadvantage of a fan? Well, noise. It's just one more something making noise inside the case. Depending on what you're doing with your PC, if you're using it to record things, if you're using it for certain functionalities where noise is an issue, too many of these fans starts to cause a problem. If you're in an automobile factory where there's a lot of tools and a lot of clanging and banging going on, no big deal, right? So the major disadvantage with fans is noise. And also, watch on the exam, these fans, again, you have to make sure there's good airflow in that case and that the exterior vents aren't blocked, because these things are pulling heat and moving it away from these various components. It's got to have somewhere to go, and we want to get it out of the case. Okay, so let's stop part 1 right here. Join me in part 2 of CPU cooling, and we'll cover the last 2 types of CPU cooling that you'll see on the exam.